Between 1845 and 1852, approximately 1 million Irish men, women, and children starved to death. During those same 7 years, more than 4,000 ships carried Irish grain, Irish cattle, Irish butter, and Irish pork out of Irish ports. The food did not stop moving, not for one single year. The ships sailed from Cork, from Dublin, from Waterford, from Limerick. They sailed east, to Liverpool, to London, to Bristol, loaded with enough food to feed every person who died. The ports were not seized by a foreign army. They were not blockaded. They were operated by the British Treasury under instructions from London. The man who wrote those instructions was Charles Edward Trevelyan, Assistant Secretary to the Treasury. He wrote in his official correspondence that the famine was, in his words, the judgment of God on an indolent and unself-reliant people. He was not removed. He was knighted. Queen Victoria, the most powerful woman on earth, sovereign of the largest empire in human history, was asked what the Crown would contribute to Irish relief. She gave £2,000, and then her government imposed a rule. No foreign ruler could donate more than the Queen. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire had offered £10,000. The British Embassy in Constantinople told him to reduce it to 1,000 because Victoria's contribution could not be seen to be exceeded. People were dying in ditches, and the Crown was managing the optics of its own charity. This is that documented story. Stay with me, because this was not a natural disaster. The paper trail, preserved in the Treasury letterbooks, the parliamentary records, and Christine Kinealy's research at the Great Hunger Institute, shows a financial mechanism so deliberate that the word famine does not describe what actually happened. To understand what killed 1 million people, you first need to understand the economy that was already extracting Ireland's wealth before a single potato turned black. By the 1840s, Ireland had become the granary of Britain. 75% of Irish agricultural land was devoted to wheat, oats, barley, and livestock, what the British administration classified as money crops. These were not grown for Irish consumption. They were grown for export. The entire system was designed to feed Britain's industrial cities, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, London, using Irish soil and Irish labor. The Irish population of over 8 million people survived almost entirely on potatoes. Not because they chose to, because the money crops their land produced were shipped to England under a tenant system that left them nothing else. The landlords who owned the land were overwhelmingly English and Anglo-Irish. Many of them had never set foot in Ireland. They lived in London, they lived in Bath, they collected their rents through agents and spent them in England. Cormac Ó Gráda, the economic historian at University College Dublin, documented that an estimated £6 million in rent was remitted out of Ireland annually in the years before the famine. That is the equivalent of approximately £150 million today, extracted every single year. Ireland was not poor. Ireland was being emptied. The tenant farmers who worked this land held no security. They could be evicted at any time for any reason. Their rent was set by the landlord. Their crops belonged to the landlord. If the rent was not paid, regardless of the reason, the landlord could and did evict the entire family. There was no appeal. There was no tribunal. There was no protection in law. The only thing that belonged to the tenant was the potato patch beside his cabin, the small strip of ground where he grew the single crop that kept his family alive. A family of 6 could survive on approximately half an acre of potatoes. It was the most efficient calorie source available to people who had been stripped of every other option. This was not an accident of geography. It was the product of centuries of deliberate land confiscation. The penal laws had stripped Catholic Irish families of the right to buy land, inherit land, or lease land for longer than 31 years. By the 1840s, approximately 5% of the population owned 95% of the land. The people who worked the soil did not own it. The people who owned it did not work it. The people who ate what the soil produced lived in England. The British government understood exactly what this system had created. In 1845, the year the Blight arrived, a royal commission had already reported on conditions in Ireland. It documented families living in one-room cabins without furniture, without bedding, sharing the space with their only asset, a single pig that would be sold to pay the rent. The commissioners noted that in many districts the people's only food was the potato, and their only beverage was water. The report was filed. Nothing changed. When Phytophthora infestans arrived in the autumn of 1845, a fungal blight that turned healthy potatoes into black rot within 48 hours of being lifted from the ground, it did not destroy Ireland's food supply. It destroyed the only part of Ireland's food supply that the Irish were allowed to eat. Everything else kept moving. The wheat, the oats, the barley, the cattle, the butter, the pork. The system did not pause. It accelerated. And here is the detail that makes everything that follows indefensible. Ireland had faced a food crisis before. In 1782, when crops failed, the Irish Parliament closed the ports. Food exports were halted. Bounties were offered to merchants who imported food into the country. Prices fell immediately. The crisis passed. The years 1782 to 1784 are barely remembered as years of distress, because the government acted. In 1845, the British government had the same option available, the same ports, the same mechanism, the same precedent. They chose not to use it. What happened next was not a failure of response. It was a specific set of Treasury decisions, authored by one man, approved by one government, and protected by one queen, that turned a crop disease into 1 million deaths. Here is how the mechanism worked. The first government response came under Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel in late 1845. Peel quietly purchased £100,000 worth of Indian corn from America and established food depots across Ireland to sell it at cost. It was an imperfect response. The corn was difficult to grind and unfamiliar to Irish stomachs, but it kept people alive. During Peel's tenure, no mass death from starvation was recorded. Then, Peel's government fell in the summer of 1846. Lord John Russell's Whig administration took power, and Charles Edward Trevelyan became the man in effective control of Irish famine relief. Trevelyan was not a politician. He was a career civil servant, assistant secretary to the Treasury, the most senior permanent official overseeing the British Exchequer. He had held the position since 1840. He answered to the Chancellor. But in practice, on the question of Ireland, Trevelyan made the decisions. His first decision was to shut down Peel's food depots. His reasoning, preserved in his own Treasury correspondence, was that government food distribution interfered with the free market. If the government sold cheap corn, private merchants would not bring food to Ireland. The market, Trevelyan argued, must be left to correct itself. He was not operating in ignorance. Sir Randolph Ruth, the commissariat officer responsible for relief in Ireland, wrote directly to Trevelyan urging him to close the ports and stop food exports. Ruth stood his ground. He insisted it was essential. Trevelyan's reply is in the public record. He wrote back, "Do not encourage the idea of prohibiting exports. Perfect free trade is the right course." The food kept leaving. In place of food depots, Trevelyan offered public works. The starving could break rocks and build roads to earn money, then use that money to buy food at market prices. The works were deliberately designed so they would not compete with private enterprise. No useful infrastructure, no drainage, no land improvement. Roads that began in empty fields and ended in empty fields. Roads to nowhere. The wages were set below market rate, because Trevelyan did not want the works to be attractive enough that healthy laborers would abandon private employment to join them. Payment was by piece rate. The weaker you were, the less you earned. The result was that starving men and women worked 12-hour days in the winter of 1846, breaking stones in freezing rain, and still could not afford to buy the food being exported from their own parishes. By March of 1847, over 700,000 people were on the public works. Between 2 and 3 million were dependent on the wages those workers brought home. The system was collapsing under its own weight. People were dying on the road gangs, under pressure from humanitarian groups, particularly the Quakers, who had set up their own relief kitchens using large iron cauldrons they called famine pots. Russell's government passed the Temporary Relief Act in February 1847. Soup kitchens were established across the country. By July of that year, over 3 million people were receiving daily rations of stirabout, a porridge made from Indian corn and rice. 3 million people fed daily. The system worked. Death rates dropped. And then Trevelyan shut it down. In late August 1847, after barely 5 months of operation, the soup kitchens were closed. Trevelyan's stated reason was that the Irish must not become habitually dependent on the British government. The cost of all future famine relief was transferred entirely to Irish ratepayers, landlords and tenant farmers, through the Poor Law Extension Act. Ireland was to pay for its own starvation. Christine Kinealy, the leading famine scholar, identified the philosophy underlying this legislation. The famine was to be treated as an exclusively Irish responsibility, not a British responsibility, not an imperial one, Irish. This was the moment the mechanism locked into place. The food depots were closed, the soup kitchens were closed, the ports remained open. The exports continued, and the only relief available required a starving family to give up their land. That was the Gregory Clause. Passed inside the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1847, the quarter-acre clause stated that any tenant holding more than a quarter acre of land was ineligible for public relief, not for food, not for the workhouse, nothing. To receive any assistance at all, a starving family had to surrender almost all of their land to the landlord first. This was not famine relief. This was a land transfer mechanism disguised as charity law. Father John O'Rourke, the author of The History of the Famine, wrote that it was the most complete engine for the slaughter and degradation of a people ever designed. The previous clause offered facilities for emigrating to those who would give up their land. The quarter-acre clause compelled them to give it up or die of hunger. John Mitchell, the Irish nationalist and journalist, called it the cheapest and most efficient of the ejectment acts. Only 3 Irish members of Parliament voted against it. The rest had been called back to Ireland by the famine itself. The clause was introduced while they were absent. It was not in the original bill. The landlords used it immediately. Between 1849 and 1854, an estimated 250,000 people were formally evicted. The real number, including those who surrendered land to enter workhouses, was closer to 500,000. 200,000 small holdings were obliterated from the Irish landscape. Tenants who surrendered all but the required quarter-acre and walked to the workhouse to apply for relief came back to find their cabins demolished. Crowbar brigades, teams hired by landlords, moved through the countryside pulling down the homes of families who had left to beg for food. Some tenants sent their children to the workhouse as orphans, registering them without parents, so they could keep their land and still have their children fed. That is the choice the Gregory Clause created. Keep your land and watch your children starve, or surrender your land and lose everything your family had held for generations. Before we go further, consider this question. A government that proved it could feed 3 million people daily chose to stop after 5 months. If you have the power and the proof that it works, and you stop, what is the accurate word for what follows? Drop your answer in the comments. The mechanism is now fully visible. Food depots closed, soup kitchens closed after 5 months of proven success, exports protected by military escort, the Gregory Clause converting starvation into land transfer. But what did this system actually produce, and what did it cost? In 1847, the year the Irish remember as Black 47, 400,000 people died of starvation and famine-related disease. That same year, Christine Kinealy's research, published in History Ireland and drawn from the surviving British port records, documents that almost 4,000 vessels carried food from Ireland to Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool, and London. The food was shipped under military guard from the most famine-stricken parts of Ireland. Ballina, Ballyshannon, Bantry, Dingle, Killala, Kilrush, Limerick, Sligo, Tralee, and Westport. The export figures for that single year are preserved in the shipping records. 39,000 tons of wheat, 98,000 tons of oats, 1 million gallons of butter, nearly 10,000 head of cattle, almost 5,000 horses and ponies, and 1,700,000 gallons of grain-derived alcohol, including 874,000 gallons of porter, 278,000 gallons of Guinness, and 183,000 gallons of whiskey. British regiments guarded the ports and the warehouses. The food moved through the most famine-stricken districts, past people who were dying on the roads outside, and onto ships bound for England. The island was producing more than enough to feed every person on it. The food left under armed escort, not just grain. The shipping manifest record peas, beans, onions, rabbits, salmon, oysters, herring, lard, honey, animal skins, and soap leaving Ireland in 1847. A wide variety of commodities, exported from a country where mothers were feeding their children grass and nettles because there was nothing else. Cecil Woodham-Smith, the historian whose work, The Great Hunger, remains the definitive account, wrote that no issue has provoked so much anger or so embittered relations between England and Ireland as the indisputable fact that huge quantities of food were exported from Ireland to England. Throughout the period when the people of Ireland were dying of starvation, and when the famine reached a point where even Parliament could not ignore it, the British government passed the Raid and Aid Act, a new tax to fund relief in the worst-hit areas. The tax was collected exclusively in Ireland, not in England, not in Scotland, not across the empire. Christine Kinealy identified the philosophy behind this decision. The Irish famine was to be treated as an exclusively Irish responsibility, not a British one, not an imperial one. Ireland was to pay for the consequences of a policy it had no power to change. The workhouses, designed to hold a limited number of local destitute in ordinary times, were overwhelmed. Built for poverty, not for catastrophe. The death rate inside them was devastating. In some unions, 1 in every 10 inmates died in a single year. Over 200,000 people died within the walls of the workhouses before the famine ended. Typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery. The overcrowding that the Gregory Clause created by forcing families off their land and into institutional care turned the workhouses into incubators of disease. The buildings that were supposed to save people killed them. Those who survived the workhouses and the evictions fled. The emigration ships, later called coffin ships, carried over 1 million people out of Ireland between 1845 and 1855. The conditions on board were so brutal that an estimated 17,000 died at sea during 1847 alone. A further 20,000 Irish people died in the quarantine stations and ditches of Canada that same year. At Grosse Isle, at Quebec, at Partridge Island, at Montreal. The bodies were buried in mass graves that are still marked today. Ireland's population before the famine was approximately 8.2 million. By 1851, it had fallen to 6.6 million, 1 million dead, over 1 million emigrated, a population decline of nearly 20% in 6 years. Ireland's population has never recovered. To this day, it remains below its 1845 level. The Choctaw Nation, a people who had themselves been forcibly marched from their homeland on the Trail of Tears barely 16 years earlier, collected $175 in gold and sent it to Ireland. A displaced and impoverished people on another continent gave what they had. The queen of the largest empire in history gave £2,000 and then made sure no one could give more. And what happened to the men who administered this system? Charles Edward Trevelyan, the man who closed the food depots, refused to stop the exports, shut down the soup kitchens after 5 months of proven success, and wrote that the great evil was not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people, was appointed Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath on the 27th of April, 1848. The KCB, awarded by Queen Victoria specifically for his services during the famine. In 1848, while the famine was still killing, Trevelyan wrote that the goal of British policy was to create a permanent good out of transient evil. The transient evil was 1 million dead. The permanent good was the restructuring of Irish land ownership. He was not investigated, he was not removed, he was not questioned, he was decorated, and then he was sent to govern Madras. The official British account of the Irish famine, the version taught in English schools for over a century, called it a natural disaster, a potato blight, an act of God, an unavoidable tragedy. The paper trail says otherwise. The Treasury letterbooks, preserved and accessible to any researcher at the National Archives in Kew, contain Trevelyan's own correspondence, directing that exports must continue, that government food aid must stop, and that the Irish must be made to pay for their own relief from resources they no longer possessed. The parliamentary records, the Hansard debates of 1847 and 1848, contain the Gregory Clause, the speeches of the Irish members who tried to oppose it, and the record that it was introduced while most Irish MPs were absent, called back to Ireland by the famine there. Parliament was debating. The commissariat records contain Sir Randolph Rout's repeated requests to close the ports and halt the exports, and Trevelyan's repeated written refusals. Perfect free trade is the right course. That sentence is in the archive. Christine Kinealy, professor of history and founding director of Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac University, has documented that almost 4,000 vessels carried food from Ireland under military guard during the worst year of the famine. Her research is based on the surviving port records at Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool, and London. The Irish port records for the same period have not survived. Cormac Ó Gráda at University College Dublin has documented the export statistics, the rent remittances, and the economic structure that made Ireland a food colony, producing for export while its own population subsisted on a single vulnerable crop. Cecil Woodham-Smith's The Great Hunger, published in 1962 and still the definitive popular history, laid out the correspondence, the policy decisions, and the human consequences in a single unbroken narrative that no subsequent historian has overturned. Queen Victoria visited Ireland once during the famine, in August of 1849, when the worst of the dying was ending. She stayed for 4 days. She attended a levee in Dublin Castle. She sailed around Cork Harbour. She described the visit in her diary as one of the most gratifying events of her reign. She did not visit a workhouse. She did not visit a famine graveyard. She did not mention the dead. Maud Gonne, the Irish nationalist, later gave Victoria the title that followed her for the rest of her reign and beyond it. She published it in 1899, the year before Victoria's final visit to Ireland. The Famine Queen. The Irish did not starve because the potatoes failed. They starved because the financial system that controlled their land, their labor, and their food supply was designed to extract wealth from Ireland. And when the extraction met a crisis, the system did not pause. It did not adapt. It did not relent. It accelerated. The Treasury made its decisions. The landlords collected their rents. The ships sailed on schedule. The military guarded the ports. The soup kitchens that fed 3 million people daily were shut down after 5 months. And 1 million people who lived on an island that was exporting enough food to feed them all were left to die. The commissariat records at the National Archives in Kew, the Treasury letterbooks. The Hansard Parliamentary debates. Christine Kinealy's research published through the Great Hunger Institute. Cormac Ó Gráda's Black 47 and Beyond at University College Dublin. Cecil Woodham-Smith's The Great Hunger, Ireland, 1845 to 1849. The port shipping records at Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool, and London. The documents are not hidden, they are not classified, they are not restricted, they are available to anyone who asks for them. The only question the documents do not answer is the one that matters most. Why did the people who had the power to stop it, and the proof that stopping it worked, choose not to? Subscribe if that question stays with you. And tell me, where are you watching this from? If you haven't seen it yet, watch the video on how the Rothschilds financed the Boer War. The same empire, the same financial mechanisms, a different continent. And if you want to see how the same patterns that destroyed nations in the 19th century are still destroying billion-dollar companies today, check out our new channel, Billion to Bust. Link in the description. I'll see you in the next one.